Hey guys, it's Selwen here, and today let's talk about that elemental Shaman, which recently got a nice swoop of changes in patch 8.1, so let's talk all about it, starting with the talents. On the tier 1 we have the Earth and Rage, Echo of the Elements, and Elemental Blast. Currently Earth and Rage is the go-to, just a simple passive to deal damage in the background as you do your abilities. It looks quite cool with these earth spikes impaling your enemies. It was never that powerful, but considering the other choices with the fact that our most powerful ability is now Lightning Bolt, is gonna make Echo of the Elements not that appealing, as Lava Burst is simply not that of an important ability right now. Even though it does make your gameplay and rotation feel better with those two charges on there, allowing you to bank it for a while instead of having to use Lava Burst itself on cooldown. It also has synergy with Master of the Elements talent here, but once again is all on Lightning Bolt now, making Echo rather weak. As for Elemental Blast, another really cool ability, dealing decent damage and granting a random secondary stat, follows the same reasoning, simply isn't worth to cast it over Lightning Bolts, even though the stats provided are really good, especially when pairing with a trait Natural Harmony, that by each element spell used, Frost, Nature, and Fire, grants another secondary stat buff. Elemental Blast will just keep that up nicely, so proc all those three elements. That said, this is only worth when you have 2 or 3 Natural Harmony traits, but even then, Earth and Rage will provide better DPS when you apply cooldowns like Storm Elemental, which forces you to focus solely on Lightning Bolts as your castable ability, losing its worth again. As for the second tier, Totem Mastery will be your go-to for totem buffs, granting 2% haste, higher elemental overload chance on lightning bolts and chain lightnings, higher flame shock damage, and generating 1 maelstrom every second. Works for everything, and it is great. As for Aftershock, can be useful on 2 target fights or heavy AoE of 5 or more targets, having a 25% chance when spending Maelstrom to refund it, allowing you to go, say, 2 Earthquakes back to back in a dungeon trash. Now that said, it is RNG after all, so personally I prefer having Totem Mastery all the time and get those benefits permanently, than relying on RNG to proc to get that extra Earthquake or even Earth Shock. As for Called Thunder, it has somewhat the same benefit as Aftershock, increasing Maelstrom by 30, so allowing you to pull more, which is useful, but also decreasing the cost of Earth Shock and Quake by 10. In the end, allowing you to use more of them, but when comparing to Aftershock, it is weaker in those niche AoE situations. In the third tier, it is mostly optional, however, the recommended choices are Spirit Wolf for most rain encounters, allowing your Spirit Wolf farm to reduce damage taken and increase its movement speed further. In a world where our mobility is absolute crap, this gets rather useful. For Mythic Plus, Static Charge can be quite useful to get a more frequent stun with Capacitator Totem, and Earth Shield is the least useful. It's an active ability, so it's taken away a global cooldown for very little worth in that self-heal, but good for outdoor or PvP. Following tier, we have a couple of interesting choices. Storm Elemental tends to be the go-to, replacing your Fire Elemental to now, instead of granting Maelstrom through your Flame Shock ticks, it makes your Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning casts to increase, or rather decrease, its cast speed by 3%. Taking in mind the focus to Lightning Bolt we have now and later talents such as Primal Elementist or even Surge of Power and Stormkeeper, makes this a must for a single target. Not only that, with Primal Elementist, will make it even a burstier option of a DPS cooldown in both AoE and single target with its Eye of the Storm ability. More on that later. As for the other choices, such as Liquid Magma Totem, is far more AoE centric but also usable in single target, a totem on relatively moderate CD to deal damage all around it. So it can be amazing for Mythic Plus or Cleave fights, but remember, Storm Elemental with Primal Elementist is also excellent for single target burst or AoE burst. So for dungeons, choose what you prefer, both work great. For our cleaving fights can surpass Storm Elemental if it's sustained for long periods of time and where you can reliably hit both of them with a totem, a niche rather, but keep in mind its usefulness in such situations. You also have to take in mind the fight timers to see if you can squeeze in extra Liquid Magma totems and not, say, 2 Storm Elemental summons. As for Master of the Elements, is a really interesting one. After each lava burst cast, you gain a buff, increasing nature, frost, or physical damage of your next spell by 20%. So it's gonna change your gameplay and adds more emphasis on lava burst, where you want to take advantage of this buff on earth shocks or quakes, mini AoE, or even lightning bolts. However, where this talent shines is if you decide to go for the Ice Fury build, where it heavily boosts your next 4 frost shocks in terms of damage and granting Maelstrom. It is not the best build currently, and I don't really recommend it unless you're seeking high mobility, as you get a lot of instant cast spells to use, but also take in mind it's a far more complicated playstyle as you're mixing a lot of your abilities in specific ways and orders. It also adds to that feel of an elementist type of caster, which I think is rather cool in an aesthetic point of view. But the idea here would be to have Echo of the Elements, Master of the Elements, and Ice Fury, and just weave in lava bursts with buffed frost shocks for optimal damage, but more on that later on. And next tier is once again optional. Do you want more survivability? Then go for Nature's Guardian. Or do you want some extra utility in the form of healing? Then Ancestral Guidance will be your choice. If mobility is an issue, then there's the Windwalk Totem, providing everyone in your group a movement speed buff, which can be really cool and useful in specific scenarios. On the following tier, we have briefly talked about Ice Fury and Primal Elementist. One thing to note on Primal Elementist is that it only allows you to summon one elemental pet at a time, as they actually become pets that you can control. As for the abilities you gain, on the fire one, you gain a Meteor, an AoE burst the ability, and an Emulate, a fire damage dot. For your Storm Elemental is that Eye of the Storm burst channel ability, and Cold Lightning to buff its own damage, and Earth Elemental very interestingly adds the stun and a defensive cooldown called Hardened Skin, reducing both you and your pet damage taken by 40%, easily missed, but very useful. As for Surge of Power, it is the new talent in 8.1, easily comparable to Primal Elementist in terms of DPS, even with Storm Elemental, but solely for single target. Earth Shocks now empowers the following abilities: Flame Shock to be applied on an additional target, Lightning Bolt to trigger Elemental Overload 1 to 3 casts, Lava Burst to reduce your Fire or Storm Elemental CD by 3 seconds, and Frost Shock to freeze the target, so root them. The ones you're going to use the most with this buff will be the Lightning Bolt version and Lava Burst. A Lightning Bolt is a no-brainer choice, but with Stormkeeper is something you would want to stack up, but more on that later. For Lava Burst is where all the number crunching will come in, where you will have to take in mind the fight time to see if it's worth using it with Lava Bursts or not to squeeze in an extra elemental summon. So yeah, needless to say, more complicated than Primal Elementist, so feel free to go for whatever the one in single target fights. And on the last tier, Stormkeeper is now our go-to for everything. Amazing for single target due to the boost to Lightning Bolt and its synergy with both Storm Elemental and Surge of Power if you're using, and in AoE, the Chain Lightning uses are equally amazing. The others, like Ascendance, really not worth. There's really no point to Lava Bursts at this point in time with your build setups. Add that to the fact that Lightning Bolt is so powerful now, and Unlimited Power is equally dead. Can come close to a Stormkeeper, but why would you? It's very RNG reliance for the overloads, procs, and movement will prevent you to keep it up reliably. With all of that covered, let's talk about rotation and gameplay with all the different talent setups or builds. First covering a single target one with the most popular Earth and Rage, Totem Mastery, Storm Elemental, Primal Elementist, and Stormkeeper with and without cooldowns, and so opener. Then talk about Surge of Power and finish off with Ice Fury, and of course the ideas in AoE situations and Cleave. So Elemental Shaman at first is a very easy spec to play with a simple resource called Maelstrom. Most of your abilities here are gonna build it or generate it, having a cap of 100. Earth Shock, single targets, and Earthquake, multi-targets need Maelstrom to be used. To build it, you're gonna need abilities like Lightning Bolt, Lava Burst, Chain Lightning, among others. Also, due to the nature of the spec currently, mainly from talents, a lot of the focus is now on Lightning Bolt, because becoming your most powerful spell damage-wise in the overall scheme of things. So in terms of priorities outside of cooldowns, we have a Totem Mastery. If using, they grant all of those great buffs, so remember to keep it up always. Plus you have Flame Shock and Lava Burst. Lava Burst generates a 10 Maelstrom, along with the fact that it is a sure crit when hitting a Flame Shocked target. So keep this in mind always to never use it on a target without Flame Shock. Also keep in mind, since 8.1 it's possible to do Lava Burst then Flame Shock as the spell travels and still gets the crit benefit. Something to keep in mind during openers that we're gonna talk about in a bit. As for Flame Shock, pretty self-explanatory, a dot to keep up for damage, and that Lava Burst synergy, refreshing anywhere below 7 seconds will be enough. It has a small cooldown, but on cliff fights or when there is about 2 to 3 mobs, aim to apply it on all of them as that damage will ramp up rather nicely. Another small tip is about movement. We are quite poor on that end and we have few abilities we can use on a move. Flame Shock can be one of them even if you're not on that preferable refresh timer of 7 seconds. Using it while on a move and saving you a global cooldown later can be beneficial. The same can be applied to Totem Mastery actually, so when you want to refresh it when it's nearing its end. After this comes your Lightning Bolt, is both your filler when nothing to click and a pretty powerful spell when we get to CDs, generating 8 Maelstrom. So again, spam this when nothing else to do. Now in between this, you might get a proc called Lava Surge coming from Flame Shock ticks, making your Lava Burst instant cast and reset its own cooldown, making it possible to even send 2 Lava Bursts if you get the proc midway of casting your current Lava Burst. Now since Lava Burst only has 1 charge outside of Echo of the Elements, you want to keep it on cooldown at all times, meaning this proc has a pretty high priority and you want to use it the minute you get it, since its instant cast is great for that nasty movement. And basically you'll keep doing this until you get the prompt saying Earth Shock is now usable. Now it only costs 60 Maelstrom, but this doesn't mean you have to use it right away. It's preferable to keep on pulling Maelstrom up to around 90, but not more, because remember abilities like Lightning Bolt and Lava Burst have a set amount of Maelstrom that they generate, but due to your Elemental Overload mastery, there's a chance you send a duplicate spell, generating an extra portion of Maelstrom as it does damage. Lava Burst at 10 plus 4 and Lightning Bolt at 8 plus 3, so on those overloads. So take in mind to not use Lava Burst whenever at 86 Maelstrom or above, to not overcap set Maelstrom, or 91 for Lightning Bolt. So around this time is when you want to use Earth Shock. Why? Well, because of movement again. Anywhere between 60 to 90-ish Maelstrom you can technically use an Earth Shock, and you should whenever there is movement required. So think of that pulling as you just waiting to move for whatever the reason. So mechanics, you want to reposition yourself. If it isn't needed, you use it anyway to of course not overcap Maelstrom, but midway through that pulling there is indeed movement, you get a powerful spell to use, making that movement have a 0 DPS loss. Some of this changes with talent choices, but we'll go over that later. That's the general idea with Earth Shock. But basically, just keep this up. Following these set rules, Frost Shock can also come in during movement if you have no Lava Surge procs, Flame Shock to be refreshed, Totem Mastery or Earth Shock to use. Keep on spamming Frost Shock while you run. The damage isn't all that bad actually, but remember, if you need to run away quick, Spirit Wolf will be a faster way to do so. Guess of Wind. RIP. If you with Elemental Blast, by the way, just use it on cooldown also over both Lava Burst and Lightning Bolt. And now with that covered, let's talk about CDs. So let's go over your opener. So in terms of CDs, we get Stormkeeper and Storm Elemental. Stormkeeper is a short spell cast that empowers your next 2 Lightning Bolts to deal more damage and trigger an Elemental Overload. Needless to say, rather powerful and excellent to burst down targets. Using it on cooldown or to take down priority targets will be your goal. Since it's technically a buff to yourself for a few seconds, feel free to cast it even before you actually pull the boss or mobs. And remember to place Totem Mastery, of course, as well. After it comes your Storm Elemental, like Stormkeeper. Using it on cooldown or to take down priority targets quick will be your goal with it. It's extremely powerful, especially with Primal Elementist, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind with it. One of its abilities, called Lightning and Eye of the Storm. When you summon it, its first spell will be ability, the so-called Call Lightning, empowering himself to deal 300% more damage. The goal here is for you to click Eye of the Storm, so remember to either keybind that ability or use a macro, check down below in the description for that. What I usually do is wait 3 seconds or so after I summon the Storm Elemental before using the Eye of the Storm, which I have combined on my mouse, so it takes benefit of that Call Lightning buff. So while that happens, you can open up with a Lava Burst and Flame Shock as a pull is gonna go down and your pet is buffing himself. After you go for Lightning Bolt and the Eye of the Storm pet ability, due to Stormkeeper, 2 are gonna be instant cast and quite powerful. If you have any trinkets and rituals, use them here as well, and you pretty much go into Lightning Bolt spam mode afterwards. Now, with each subsequent bolt, its cast time is decreased. Because of that, you no longer use Lava Bursts, and use Lightning Bolts and Earth Shocks only when nearing the cap or, again, movement. Only time you want to use Lava Bursts with Storm Elemental up is if with the Lava Surge proc and you need to move, so you just throw that Lava Burst instant cast because why not? But besides that, just focus on Lightning Bolts when standing still. As for keeping things like Flame Shock up, you want to, but not above 14 stacks of that same Storm Elemental buff. The same follows for Elemental Blast if you're using, but basically Storm Elemental and Bloodlust means super quick Lightning Bolts to the point is actually ridiculous and almost instant, but also rather fun. Once it goes down, you resume your normal priorities. Now, a couple of changes is if you with Surge of Power. Pet management is gone, but there is some extra management with Earth Shock uses. The empowerment you want to use it most is with Lightning Bolt. So uses in general stay the same, just remember after each Earth Shock to go for Lightning Bolt and nothing else. Lava Burst for the CD reduction on Storm Elemental is great, but you really have to go around and do some math, checking fight timers to see if it's worth or not, to say use 5 Lava Bursts or only Lava Bursts with Surge of Power for a reduction of a few seconds to squeeze in an extra Storm Elemental. Just a small simple example, but that's the idea with it. A bit complicated, but that's the way of things. That said, Stormkeeper and Surge of Power also gets interesting. Its uses both on opener and afterwards, so mid-fight, are the same, and then the idea with them is to stack them for extra overloads, meaning pulling to high Maelstrom nearing the cap, then Earth Shock, Stormkeeper or Stormkeeper before, then the Lightning Bolt, that will trigger Elemental Overload at that very high damage, plus the ones from Surge of Power, then a Lava Burst to get to 60 plus Maelstrom again, another Earth Shock, and the second empowered Lightning Bolt from Stormkeeper for those bigger hits. Slightly more complicated than Primal Elementist, but not by much. As for the Ice Fury, Master of the Elements type of build, the idea here stays the same in terms of your other spells, just a weaving in of Lava Burst, Changes, and Ice Fury. You want to use it on cooldown, Ice Fury that is, but to use those Frost Shocks, you want to use it with a Lava Burst, Master of the Elements as well when possible. So weaving those two spells with each other, only use Frost Shocks with Ice Fury without Master of the Elements buff if it's about to drop and you have no Lava Bursts available. Earth Shock is also to be used with Master of the Elements, so delay if necessary. The same follows for the Stormkeeper Lightning Bolts. It's all about setting up these empowerments beforehand to get that 20% damage increase. All of this can get a bit tricky since there's a lot of different buttons to click, but these relatively simple rules and priority once you get it going, as you can see here on the list, to give you some sort of visual feedback. Now on to AoE. Fights with 2 targets, nothing changes. Besides spreading Flame Shock, you also want to change from Earth Shock to Earthquake. For 3 targets and above, you're gonna stop Lightning Bolts altogether and just go for Chain Lightning. You can use Lava Burst, but only on proc. Try to spread Flame Shocks too, if they are on long-lived mobs, that is, on just up to 3 targets. On 5 targets or more, just do Chain Lightning and Earthquakes with, of course, cities like Stormkeeper or Storm Elemental. There are amazing burst tools for both for those overloads or the Eye of the Storm ability. Flame Shock, again, you can try to keep on 3 targets if they are long-lived mobs. If you have Liquid Magma Totem, use on cooldown as well, place it wisely. If with Master of the Elements instead, keep on using Lava Bursts, preferably with the proc to make it easier for you to empower Earthquakes or the Stormkeeper Chain Lightnings. It's really simple and fun AoE rotation, unless you go for the Master of the Elements, but using your cooldowns appropriately will be key in things like Mythic Plus. Use them often on tough trash packs, but have them ready for bosses as well. This is Stormkeeper and the Storm element with the Eye of the Storm ability. And yeah, that covers it all. Let's talk about traits and stats to wrap it up. So traits here, we mentioned a couple. Question you might have is on Tectonic Thunder and Natural Harmony for that buff. You don't necessarily need to cast a Frost Shocks to keep the buff active. The nature type and the fire type is just kept naturally, but the mastery provided from the frost element isn't all that important. But if you so wish to keep it up, you can if you have 2 or the 3 traits of it, or again if you decide to go for Elemental Blast, even though I recommend Earth and Rage anyway. As for Tectonic Thunder, it's really good for AoE, just remember those instant cast Chain Lightnings when it procs. In terms of stats, Intellect is usually king, but both crit and haste are your most valuable. Generally, crit values slightly higher, while haste remains equally powerful till around 15%, so aim to stack up those 2 stats. Crit is even better for Elemental, as our crits deal 250% more damage instead of the 200 other specs have. Haste just makes everything go faster, which means more casts and more Maelstrom generated. Mastery is a great stat in terms of what it does, so the overloads, but stacking it up is really not worth it. Verse is okay, not as good as crit or haste, but better than mastery, so having some will be pretty decent also. So yeah, that covers it all. Hope it helps, and as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to get more videos like this, and check out my Patreon if you wish to support the channel. Have a fantastic day everyone, and I'll see you all next time. See ya!